Darius Durant's morning routine had become second nature over the years. His alarm clock's gentle buzz filled the quiet pre-dawn room, signaling the start of another day. With practiced ease, he rose, stretched, and splashed cool water on his face, wiping away the last traces of sleep. As he donned his postal uniform, its familiar blue fabric snug around his shoulders, he took a moment to look in the mirror, straightening his badge. The emblem of an eagle on his chest represented more than a job to him. It was his pledge to serve the people of Copper Hill, a small but tightly knit community where each person was more than just an address on his route. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, he stepped out onto the quiet street, breathing in the crisp, early morning air. Copper Hill was just beginning to stir, with a hint of light peeking over the horizon. As he drove his mail van through the winding streets, he nodded to the early risers. Joggers, dog walkers, and newspaper collectors who waved as they recognized him. To them, Darius was a daily fixture, as familiar as the sun rising over the hills. The rhythm of his deliveries provided comfort, each stop a small thread in the fabric of his routine. He took pride in his work, in the quiet connections he built with each resident. He saw himself as a silent guardian, moving through the neighborhood in ways few noticed but many appreciated. His daily route was more than a job. It was his way of staying in touch with the pulse of the town. As he approached Elm Street, Darius felt a spark of anticipation. One of his favorite stops awaited him: Mrs. Thompson's house. Jane Thompson was one of the neighborhood's most cherished figures, a widow who had lived in Copper Hill for decades. She was the epitome of warmth and resilience, always meeting him with a friendly smile and a few kind words. She had seen generations grow up, guiding them with wisdom and gentle advice. Darius fondly remembered how she would often leave out a fresh lemon bar or a cold lemonade on hot days, her small acts of kindness brightening his otherwise predictable workday. But today, something felt different as he neared her home. The meticulously maintained yard he was used to seeing was noticeably untended. Overgrown weeds peeked through the flower beds, and fallen leaves gathered in scattered piles around the porch. He slowed the van, frowning as he observed the details that didn't quite add up. Mrs. Thompson's garden, usually a burst of seasonal colors, seemed dull and neglected. When he parked and stepped out of his van, he noticed a small stack of newspapers, yellowed from sun exposure, sitting at the foot of her front steps. The sight unsettled him. Mrs. Thompson was never one to let her porch gather clutter. She had a keen eye for tidiness and a fondness for order. Darius's mind raced through explanations, trying to justify the oddity. Perhaps she had been away visiting family or taking a brief holiday. Still, the accumulation of small signs hinted at something unusual. He walked up the pathway to her door, the concrete warmed by the morning sun. Darius hesitated for a moment, considering whether to knock or simply leave her mail in the overflowing mailbox. His hand hovered above the doorbell before he finally pressed it, its faint chime echoing through the silent house. He waited, shifting his weight as he strained to hear any signs of movement. Seconds ticked by, stretching into a long minute of silence. Frowning, Darius pressed the doorbell again, this time following it with a few gentle knocks on the door. Still no response. A knot of unease began to form in his stomach. Mrs. Thompson was usually prompt in answering, her face often appearing in the doorway within moments of his arrival. Her absence now felt ominous, an unsettling contrast to her usual warm welcome. As he pondered what to do next, the sound of a garden hose caught his attention. Darius turned to see Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Thompson's neighbor, tending to his rose bushes. Mr. Jenkins was an elderly man with a thin frame, his movements slow but deliberate. Darius walked over, raising a hand in greeting. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," Darius called out, trying to keep his tone light. "I was just delivering a package to Mrs. Thompson. Have you seen her around?" Mr. Jenkins squinted, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Morning, Darius. Can't say I have." He paused, looking thoughtful. "Come to think of it, it's been a couple of weeks since I've seen Jane outside. Used to see her every day, out here in her garden, or at her window with that cup of tea. But now that you mention it, his voice trailed off, a note of concern creeping in. Darius's unease grew stronger, twisting into a knot of worry. You think she might be out of town? He asked, trying to sound hopeful. Mr. Jenkins shook his head slowly. If she was, she would have told me. We always check in on each other. He glanced at Mrs. Thompson's house, his brows furrowed. She's always been there, rain or shine. This doesn't feel right. Darius nodded, his mind racing. The small details, the untended garden, the pile of newspapers, and Mr. Jenkins' account painted a picture he didn't want to accept. He knew he couldn't ignore the feeling tugging at him, urging him to look deeper. Returning to the van, Darius climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel as he considered his options. He could continue his route, chalking it up to Mrs. Thompson needing some time alone. Or he could take a moment to knock on the door one last time, to ensure she was truly all right. But as he replayed the details in his mind, the disorder he had glimpsed, the silence that greeted him at the door, he felt a pang of responsibility settle in his chest. Finally, he made a decision. He'd come back later, once he had completed his deliveries. If Mrs. Thompson didn't respond then, he would find another way to reach out. He could contact a family member or alert someone in the community. But he wouldn't let the day end without making sure she was okay. As he turned the van's ignition, the weight of his worry pressed down on him, making the familiar rumble of the engine feel less reassuring than it usually did. As he pulled away, he cast a final glance at her home in the rearview mirror, feeling a nagging sense that he was leaving something crucial unfinished. The rest of his route passed by in a blur, the usual faces and friendly exchanges barely registering as his thoughts continued to drift back to Elm Street. Darius had been part of the community long enough to know the weight of his role. To some, he was merely the mailman. To others, he was a lifeline, the steady presence they could count on. And for Mrs. Thompson, he knew he was more than just the person who brought her mail. He was a connection to the world outside her quiet home. By the time his midday break rolled around, Darius had resolved to return to Mrs. Thompson's house. He'd make sure she was all right, even if it meant knocking a little louder or calling out to her from the porch. Whatever it took, he would find a way to ensure her safety. With renewed determination, he climbed back into his van, ready to retrace his steps back to Elm Street, where a mystery waited just behind a closed door. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Copper Hill as Darius turned the van onto Elm Street for the second time that day. The houses along the street were bathed in warm, golden light, their windows reflecting the sun's fading rays. Yet, as he approached Mrs. Thompson's house, Darius felt a chill settle over him. The house seemed even more forlorn than it had that morning, its windows dark and unwelcoming, the neglected garden giving it an air of abandonment. Parking along the curb, he took a deep breath and got out, his footsteps crunching on the gravel pathway leading up to her door. He couldn't shake the sense of unease that had followed him all day, lingering like a shadow. Darius had hoped that by some miracle she might have returned to her normal routine. And this time, she'd open the door with a smile and a few words about the weather or her garden. But something told him that wasn't going to happen. As he approached her front door, a faint, unpleasant odor reached his nose. It was subtle but distinct, a strange mix of mildew and something sweetly sour, like food left too long in a warm room. He wrinkled his nose, instinctively recoiling. The smell only intensified his resolve to check on her, to make sure she was safe. He pressed the doorbell once more, listening to the muffled chime echoing within the house. Seconds passed, stretching into long, silent moments. There was no movement, no sound of shuffling footsteps or a creak of floorboards. Darius shifted his weight, feeling a growing sense of urgency. He rapped his knuckles against the door firmly, his voice rising with concern. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Darius, your mailman. Are you all right?" Silence. Darius frowned, his gaze falling to the worn doormat beneath his feet. It was the same mat he'd seen for years, faded but still bearing the cheerful message, "Welcome." Somehow, it felt oddly out of place now, like a relic of a time when the house had been alive with warmth and routine. Shaking his head, he stepped back, scanning the house for any sign of life. Just as he was about to give up, he heard a faint sound from within, a soft, almost inaudible shuffle, as though someone were moving inside. He leaned closer to the door, his heart pounding. "Mrs. Thompson," he called again, louder this time. "Can you hear me?" The shuffling stopped, replaced by another moment of silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open just a crack, and a frail, bony hand appeared on the edge of the doorframe, gripping it with a trembling grasp. The sight of her hand alone was enough to make his heart sink. The skin was pale and thin, veins prominent beneath the surface. He could tell, even from the small glimpse, that Mrs. Thompson was not well. The door opened wider, and there she stood, Jane Thompson, the once vibrant woman he remembered, now a ghostly figure. Her silver hair, once neatly styled, hung in matted strands around her face. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were sunken, dark circles shadowing them like bruises. Her clothes, a once clean house dress, were stained and wrinkled, clinging loosely to her thin frame. "Darius," she murmured, her voice weak and barely audible. She swayed slightly, as though standing took a great effort. "Mrs. Thompson, are you all right?" he asked gently, stepping forward to steady her. He placed a hand on her arm, feeling how fragile she seemed, like she might shatter at the slightest touch. She shook her head, her eyes unfocused, as though she were struggling to remember where she was. I don't feel quite myself, Darius," she whispered. Her voice had a tremor in it, a vulnerability that was both heartbreaking and alarming. "Do you need a doctor? Is there someone I can call for you?" he asked, his concern mounting. He glanced inside, catching a glimpse of her living room. The sight shocked him. The room, usually pristine and orderly, was in complete disarray. Papers, old newspapers, and food wrappers were scattered across the floor. A few empty cups and plates lay on the coffee table, some with mold beginning to creep along their edges. The furniture was covered in dust, and an old threadbare blanket was draped across the sofa. Mrs. Thompson followed his gaze, her expression clouding as though she were only just noticing the state of her home. "I've been feeling under the weather," she said weakly, looking away in embarrassment. "Just haven't had the energy to keep things in order." Darius's heart ached at the sight of her. "Mrs. Thompson, please, let me call someone. A family member, maybe. You shouldn't be here alone if you're unwell." She shook her head slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't want to be a bother, Darius," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I'll be fine, truly." The determination in her tone was unmistakable, but Darius couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong. He glanced at her face again, noticing small bruises along her cheekbone and a faint cut near her hairline, almost hidden beneath her disheveled hair. He hesitated, torn between respecting her wishes and following his gut feeling, which was screaming that she needed help. As he tried to think of what to do, his gaze drifted downward, and he noticed her clothes again. A stain had spread across the front of her dress, a deep, rusty red that looked disturbingly fresh. The smell, that sickly sweet odor, seemed stronger now, wafting from inside the house and mingling with the summer air. He felt his stomach twist as he realized the stain was likely blood. "Mrs. Thompson, please," he said softly, swallowing his fear. "This isn't just about being under the weather. You're hurt, and I think you might need some medical attention." For a moment, she seemed to waver, her eyes darting toward the door, as though she wanted to shut it and retreat into the shadows of her home. But something in Darius's tone, in his steady gaze, made her pause. Her shoulders slumped, and she gave a small, defeated nod. I don't know what happened, Darius," she admitted, her voice breaking. I think I I fell, but I don't remember. I just woke up and everything felt wrong." Her words sent a chill down his spine. Memory loss, injuries, and a disordered home. All signs that pointed to something far more serious than a simple fall. Darius took a steadying breath, his mind racing. He knew he had to act quickly, but he also knew he needed to handle this delicately, not wanting to scare her. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to call for some help, all right? Just to make sure you're safe. Maybe they can help you figure out what's going on and get you back on your feet." She hesitated, her eyes wide and fearful, but then she gave a small nod, as though surrendering to his concern. "All right, Darius," she whispered, "if you think it's best." With a reassuring smile, he pulled out his phone, stepping back onto the porch to make the call. As he spoke with the emergency operator, explaining the situation in careful, measured words, he glanced back at Mrs. Thompson. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and a deep, lingering sadness. The operator assured him that help was on the way, and he hung up, turning back to her. "They'll be here soon, Mrs. Thompson," he said gently. "They're just going to check you over, make sure you're all right." She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to ward off a chill. "Thank you, Darius," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He stayed by her side, watching as she leaned against the doorframe, her frail form seeming even smaller and more fragile in the harsh light of the afternoon. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to see her through whatever was happening. This was no longer just a delivery stop on his route. It was a call to action, a moment that demanded he be more than just her mailman. Within minutes, the sound of an approaching ambulance broke the silence, and Darius felt a surge of relief. The paramedics stepped out, moving with calm, practiced efficiency as they approached. He explained the situation briefly, watching as they spoke gently to Mrs. Thompson, asking her questions and taking her pulse. As they led her to the ambulance, Darius stayed back, his heart heavy. He didn't know what the next steps would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He'd be there for Mrs. Thompson, just as she had always been there for him and the rest of the community. Whatever had brought her to this point, he'd make sure she wasn't facing it alone. The ambulance's flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving Darius standing alone on Mrs. Thompson's porch. The stillness of the street pressed around him, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower a few houses down. He lingered for a moment, looking back at the open door and the unsettling interior of the house, knowing he couldn't just walk away now. Not with the image of Mrs. Thompson's frail, wounded face still fresh in his mind. After a few moments of hesitation, he stepped back inside, drawn by a compulsion to understand what had happened here. He knew the paramedics would be taking Mrs. Thompson to the hospital for a thorough checkup, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, something hidden in the disarray of her once tidy home. The odor hit him again as he stepped over the threshold, a mix of decay, mustiness, and something sharp and metallic. Swallowing down his discomfort, he surveyed the living room, its neglected state telling its own story. Dust coated every surface, and a fine layer of grime covered the windows, muting the light that struggled to enter. Papers and magazines lay strewn across the floor, some torn and crumpled as though in a fit of frustration. The coffee table, usually pristine, was crowded with stacks of dishes and empty glasses, many with remnants of dried food clinging to them. Darius moved slowly through the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. In all his years on this route, he had never seen Mrs. Thompson's home in such disrepair. It was like walking through a ghost of the life she'd once lived, a life of order and grace now overshadowed by something darker. As he moved toward the kitchen, he felt a pang of sorrow. Memories of Mrs. Thompson flooded his mind. The warmth in her eyes when she'd offered him a cup of tea, her delighted laugh as she showed him her blooming roses last spring. This woman had once been full of life, a beacon of kindness in his daily routine. Now she was a mere shadow of herself, and he couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to this point. The kitchen was even worse. Dirty dishes filled the sink, and pots sat on the stovetop, some still holding scraps of rotting food. Flies buzzed around, disturbed by his presence. He spotted an empty bottle of prescription pills on the counter, its label faded and unreadable, adding to his growing suspicion. Had she been unwell for longer than he realized? And if so, why hadn't anyone noticed? As he scanned the counter, a piece of paper caught his eye, a crumpled envelope with his own handwriting scrawled on it. He reached for it, recognizing it as a note he'd left her weeks ago about a delayed package. It was strange, almost surreal, to see his own words here in the midst of such chaos. He tucked the envelope back, feeling an odd sense of connection to this unraveling mystery. A quiet sound, barely more than a whisper, broke the silence. Darius froze, straining to listen. It was coming from the back of the house, somewhere near the hallway leading to the bedrooms. His pulse quickened. Was someone else here? "Hello," he called out, his voice low but firm. The sound stilled. Heart pounding, he moved cautiously toward the hallway, feeling a strange pull, a sense that someone, was waiting just out of sight. As he stepped closer, he saw the faint outline of a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, leading to Mrs. Thompson's bedroom. The bedroom was a jarring contrast to the rest of the house. While the living room and kitchen showed signs of neglect and decay, the bedroom seemed almost untouched, as though it had been preserved in time. The bed was neatly made, its white quilt smoothed and tucked in with precision. A single pair of slippers sat at the foot of the bed, lined up perfectly. The nightstand held a small framed photograph of a younger Mrs. Thompson, laughing beside a man Darius assumed was her late husband. Their smiles radiated happiness, a stark contrast to the haunting stillness of the room. He noticed an odd detail on the nightstand. A notebook, its cover faded and worn, but clearly well used. Driven by a sudden urge, he picked it up, flipping through its pages. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, each entry a brief note about her day, a small reflection on life. But as he turned the pages, he noticed a shift. The entries became erratic, the handwriting more haphazard, as though she'd been losing control of her thoughts. One entry, scrawled with trembling letters, stood out to him. "I can feel him watching again. I know it's not real, but he's there. I can feel him in the walls, in the air. I'm not alone in this house." Darius felt a chill crawl up his spine. She had written about feeling watched, about a presence she couldn't explain. His eyes darted around the room, his mind racing with questions. Was she experiencing a mental decline, or was something darker at play? He closed the notebook, setting it carefully back on the nightstand, his thoughts swirling. As he stepped back, his foot brushed against something soft. Looking down, he saw a small, hand-knitted scarf, one he recognized as something she'd often wear on chilly mornings. It was frayed, as though it had been gripped tightly, pulled and twisted. He knelt down, feeling a sense of sadness settle over him. This woman had been so strong, so present in his life and in the lives of others. Whatever had happened to her had stripped her of that strength, leaving her vulnerable and alone. As he stood up, his phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from his supervisor at the post office, checking in on his route. Darius quickly replied, assuring them he'd be back on track shortly, though he had no intention of leaving until he felt he'd done all he could for Mrs. Thompson. He stepped back out into the hallway, closing the bedroom door softly behind him. The living room seemed even darker now, the afternoon sun casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the cluttered floor. Darius knew he'd have to report what he'd seen, if only to ensure that Mrs. Thompson received the help she clearly needed. As he exited the house, locking the door behind him, he took a moment to gather his thoughts. He could feel the weight of what he'd just uncovered pressing down on him, a silent plea for justice, for understanding. Mrs. Thompson had been suffering in silence, hiding her pain and fear behind a closed door, and as he walked back to his van, Darius made a promise to himself that he would do everything he could to help her. Back in the van, he pulled out his phone again, dialing the number for Adult Protective Services. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing call, explaining to the agent on the other end the details of what he'd discovered. They assured him they would investigate further, but Darius couldn't shake the feeling that he was only scratching the surface. As he drove away, his mind kept returning to the notebook, to the haunting words she'd scrawled in a shaky hand. He tried to focus on the rest of his deliveries, on the familiar faces who waved as he passed, but his thoughts kept circling back to Mrs. Thompson and the mystery that surrounded her. By the time he finished his route, night had fallen over Copper Hill. The stars glittered overhead, their light casting a faint glow over the town. Darius parked the van back at the post office and walked home, his footsteps slow, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, just as Mrs. Thompson had written. He chalked it up to his imagination, to the lingering tension from the day's events. But as he climbed into bed that night, the silence felt heavy, oppressive. The memory of her haunted words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in years, Darius found it difficult to sleep. In the morning, he would follow up with the hospital, check on Mrs. Thompson, and make sure she was safe. But until then, he lay awake, feeling the weight of her fear, the unsettling presence she had sensed. The next steps were unclear, but he knew one thing for certain. He was in this for the long haul, and he wouldn't rest until Mrs. Thompson was safe from whatever shadows had taken hold of her life. The next morning, Darius woke early, the events of the previous day weighing heavily on his mind. The silence in his small apartment felt stifling, each creak and groan of the old building amplified by his thoughts. He could still picture Mrs. Thompson's face, hollow and fearful, her eyes dark with an emptiness he couldn't shake. He replayed their brief, disjointed conversation in his mind, each word a puzzle piece he couldn't quite fit together. After a quick breakfast, he pulled on his uniform, then checked his phone. No messages or updates. He debated calling the hospital directly to check on her, but worried it might cross a line. Despite his hesitation, his concern for her well-being won out, and he found himself dialing the hospital's number. After a few rings, a nurse picked up, her voice warm and professional. "Good morning, Copper Hill Medical Center. How may I assist you?" "Hi, yes," Darius began, feeling a pang of nerves. "I'm calling to check on a patient, Mrs. Jane Thompson. I was the one who called for help yesterday." There was a brief pause as the nurse checked her records. Mrs. Thompson. She was admitted yesterday afternoon. I'm sorry, but unless you're a family member, I can't release any detailed information. But she's stable and in good hands." Darius felt a wave of relief at the word stable. Though he wanted to press for more details, he respected the boundaries. "Thank you," he replied, swallowing the worry that lingered in his throat. "I just wanted to make sure she's being looked after." As he hung up, he stared at his phone, conflicted. Mrs. Thompson had no immediate family that he knew of. The thought of her lying in that hospital room, alone and possibly confused, gnawed at him. But he knew he couldn't do much more than wait. His mind drifted back to the notebook he'd found in her bedroom, to the disturbing notes she'd scrawled in fits of desperation. He'd seen enough to know that Mrs. Thompson's problems extended beyond physical illness. If she was facing some form of mental decline, it explained some things: the disarray, the isolation, the fear in her eyes. Yet his gut told him there was more to it, something lurking just out of reach. Trying to shake the feeling, he left his apartment, determined to finish his deliveries. But as he made his rounds, he couldn't ignore the gnawing questions. Was her decline truly a result of age, or was there something deeper at play? His mind circled back to the strange details he'd found in her home. The empty pill bottles, the food left to rot in the kitchen, and the chilling words in her notebook. After lunch, he couldn't resist the urge any longer. He decided to make a stop at the local library, a quiet haven of information, where he could start his own investigation. He was no detective, but something inside him wouldn't rest until he knew what was happening to Mrs. Thompson. The library was almost empty, the usual quiet intensified by the absence of patrons. He made his way to the back, where the dusty shelves of old town records and newspapers were kept. Darius started flipping through the archives, unsure of what he was even looking for. He just knew he needed to understand Mrs. Thompson's life better. He found her name listed in the archives. Birth announcements, a brief mention of her husband's passing in a local obituary, and several articles detailing her contributions to community events over the years. But there was little else, no clear answer to what might have caused her sudden decline. After an hour of searching, he found himself staring at an article from 5 years ago. The headline was small, buried among other local news, but it caught his eye. Local woman found after 3-day disappearance. His breath caught as he scanned the article, his eyes widening as he read the details. The article was about Mrs. Thompson. 5 years earlier, she had gone missing for 3 days, only to be found wandering near the town's outskirts, disoriented and unable to recall where she'd been. According to the article, she'd been taken to the hospital for observation, but was released shortly after, claiming she felt fine. The article mentioned that she'd brushed it off as a misunderstanding, a brief lapse in memory. Her neighbors had attributed it to stress after her husband's death, but Darius could see the signs of a pattern now, a pattern of incidents no one had noticed, or perhaps had chosen to ignore. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. Her disorientation, her sense of being watched, and her inability to remember basic details. It wasn't new. It was something she'd been battling for years, likely in silence, with no one around to notice her gradual descent. As he sat back in his chair, his mind raced. He felt a growing anger at the system that had let her down, the people around her who hadn't thought to check in, the neighbors who hadn't seen the warning signs. Copper Hill prided itself on being a close-knit community, but in reality, Mrs. Thompson had been suffering in plain sight, and no one had bothered to notice. Lost in thought, he nearly jumped when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his supervisor at the post office, a reminder about tomorrow's mandatory meeting. Darius quickly replied, promising to be there, but his mind was elsewhere. He glanced around the library, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by a sense of responsibility. Mrs. Thompson had nobody, and he knew he couldn't just walk away. Later that day, as he finished his route, he decided to stop by the hospital, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson, even if just through her room's window. Maybe seeing her, knowing she was all right, would ease the guilt weighing on his heart. At the hospital, he walked up to the front desk, where a nurse looked up from her paperwork with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Darius replied, doing his best to sound casual. "I'm here to check on Jane Thompson. I'm a friend." The nurse's smile softened as she checked the visitor list. Mrs. Thompson is actually allowed one visitor for the evening. She's in room 212, down the hall on the left." Darius thanked her, his heart racing as he walked toward her room. Part of him still felt unsure about intruding on her privacy, but the thought of her lying alone, perhaps scared or confused, pushed him forward. He reached her door, hesitating for a moment before gently knocking. "Come in," came a faint voice from inside. Darius opened the door slowly, stepping into the dimly lit room. Mrs. Thompson lay on the hospital bed, her frail frame dwarfed by the sheets around her. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment her eyes flickered with recognition. "Darius," she said, a faint smile appearing on her lips. You came to see me." He smiled, feeling a wave of relief. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. I wanted to make sure you're all right." She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting to the window. I don't remember much, Darius. Everything's fuzzy. But thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." As they sat together in silence, Darius took her hand gently, feeling the weight of her gratitude settle on his heart. She looked at him, her eyes clearing for a moment. "It's strange, Darius," she whispered. I feel like there's someone else in that house. Someone I can't see, but I know is there. Darius's spine tingled as he recalled the words in her notebook, the scribbled notes about feeling washed. He could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that seemed rooted in something deeper, more intangible. "I'm going to help you, Mrs. Thompson," he said firmly, squeezing her hand. "Whatever's going on, I'll make sure you're safe." She nodded, but a tear slipped down her cheek. "Thank you, Darius," she murmured, her voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "I'm so tired. Tired of feeling like I'm losing myself." As she closed her eyes, Darius sat by her side, determined not to leave until she fell asleep. In that quiet moment, he made a silent vow to himself. He would find out what had caused this decline, why she had been alone for so long without help. He would do whatever it took to bring light back into her life. The shadows of doubt lingered in his mind, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't abandon her. Whatever lay hidden in the corners of her past, whatever fears haunted her, he would stand by her side until she found peace. The morning after visiting Mrs. Thompson in the hospital, Darius awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't shake the haunting image of her frail form lying in that hospital bed, her eyes clouded with a mix of fear and gratitude. He knew he had done the right thing by calling for help, but he also knew that his job wasn't over. Mrs. Thompson was battling something far darker than he'd anticipated, and he was determined to bring her some sense of peace. After finishing his route that day, he decided to dig deeper. His first stop was the town library, where he hoped to find more about the unusual disappearance Mrs. Thompson had experienced 5 years ago. He remembered the chilling entry in her notebook about feeling washed, and the haunting words she murmured to him in the hospital. Could her feelings of being watched be linked to that strange incident? He returned to the dusty archives section of the library, where the librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Ellen, greeted him with a smile. "Back so soon, Darius?" she asked, clearly surprised. Darius returned her smile, though it was strained. "Yeah, actually. I'm looking into something a little unusual." Ellen's eyes sparkled with curiosity as she leaned over the counter. "I'm all ears. What's on your mind?" Darius hesitated, wondering how much to share. But Ellen was one of those people who seemed to understand things instinctively. He found himself recounting Mrs. Thompson's strange disappearance 5 years ago and her current condition. Ellen's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, there are stories, old town tales, about disappearances like that. People vanish for days or weeks, then come back with no memory of where they've been. Some of the older residents say it's like they step out of time, like they've wandered into some other world." Darius chuckled, though the idea sent a chill down his spine. "You mean like they'd gone into some kind of alternate reality?" She shrugged. "Call it what you will. But it's not unheard of. It's rare, of course, but there's one story I remember hearing from my grandmother. She used to say that some of the older homes in Copper Hill, especially those with certain types of architecture, were built on thin places, spots where the walls between our world and another are thinner. People would claim they'd seen shadows moving, things disappearing and reappearing, or even sensed strange presences, but no one took it seriously." Darius considered her words, feeling a strange sense of validation. Do you think that could have anything to do with what's happening to Mrs. Thompson?" Ellen's eyes softened. "I don't know, Darius. But I do know this town has its secrets. Sometimes the past finds ways to reach out to the present." He thanked her, his mind racing as he left the library. Her words had ignited something in him, a sense that maybe Mrs. Thompson's experience wasn't just a result of aging or stress. Perhaps there was something more. It sounded absurd, he knew, but he'd seen enough strange things in her house to start questioning everything he thought he knew. The sun was dipping below the horizon by the time he reached Mrs. Thompson's street. He hadn't planned on stopping by her house again, but his feet seemed to lead him there of their own accord. The house loomed before him, dark and quiet, its windows reflecting the fiery hues of the setting sun. He felt a tug of apprehension as he approached, but something else, something stronger, pulled him forward. He stepped onto the porch and, after a brief moment of hesitation, unlocked the door with the spare key he found hidden under her doormat. The air inside was stale, carrying that same faint, unpleasant odor that had haunted him during his last visit. He flicked on the light in the entryway, the bulb flickering briefly before casting a weak glow over the dusty floor. As he made his way to the living room, he noticed something peculiar. A small weathered box sat on the coffee table, half hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers. He didn't remember seeing it before, though the house had been in such disarray that he couldn't be certain. Intrigued, he carefully lifted it, feeling a strange weight as he held it in his hands. The box was simple, crafted from dark wood with intricate carvings along the edges. He opened it cautiously, revealing an assortment of yellowed papers and small trinkets, a brooch shaped like a dove, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a single black and white photograph. The photograph stopped him in his tracks. It was a picture of a younger Mrs. Thompson, smiling in front of what appeared to be an old stone building. She looked happy, carefree, and beside her was a man he assumed was her late husband. But it was the background that caught his attention. The building behind them wasn't in Copper Hill. It was an unfamiliar structure with Gothic arches and weathered stone walls, like something out of a different time. Beneath the photograph was a slip of paper with a strange symbol drawn on it, a circle with interwoven lines in the shape of a spiral. Darius felt a prickle of recognition, as though he'd seen the symbol somewhere before. He tucked the photograph and paper back into the box, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He had the nagging feeling that these items held answers to questions he couldn't yet understand. As he replaced the box, a low creak echoed through the house, and he froze, straining to listen. It sounded like footsteps, distant but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. Darius's pulse quickened as he turned toward the source of the sound, half expecting to see a shadow pass through the doorway. "Hello," he called, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was no answer, but the silence felt heavy, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. He took a few cautious steps toward the hallway, his heart pounding. The sound of his own breathing was loud in his ears, and he forced himself to stay calm, to remind himself that he was alone. But as he reached the doorway to the hallway, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A faint impression, like a footprint, was visible on the dusty floorboards, leading from Mrs. Thompson's bedroom down the hall. The print was small, delicate, as though someone had walked through the dust with bare feet. His rational mind struggled to make sense of it. Mrs. Thompson had been taken to the hospital, and he was the only one with access to the house. And yet there it was, a single footprint, as clear as day, marking a path he couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, he followed the footprint down the hall to Mrs. Thompson's bedroom, the place he'd last seen her notebook. He felt a chill as he opened the door, finding the room unchanged since his last visit. But something drew his eye to the nightstand, where her notebook sat, closed and undisturbed. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most of the entries were familiar, brief notes about her garden, her daily routine. But as he neared the end, he noticed a few pages had been torn out, their jagged edges leaving an unsettling void. He turned to the last page, where a single sentence was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "I am not alone. He is watching. He is waiting." Darius's hand trembled as he read the words, a sense of dread settling over him. The entry was dated just days before he had found her at the door, disheveled and terrified. He felt an overwhelming urge to get out of the house, to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to close in around him. As he turned to leave, his gaze fell on the mirror across from the bed. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure in the reflection, a shadow standing just behind him, its face obscured, its presence heavy and menacing. He whipped around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. He backed out of the room, nearly tripping over his own feet as he hurried down the hall. The silence of the house felt suffocating, each creak and groan amplifying his fear. He left the house as quickly as he could, locking the door behind him and taking a deep breath of the cool evening air. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him from the shadows. Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in his mind. "I feel like there's someone else in that house. Someone I can't see, but I know is there." Darius knew that he'd stumbled upon something far darker than he'd anticipated, something that went beyond logic or reason. Whatever haunted Mrs. Thompson, whatever lingered in her home, wasn't just in her mind. It was real, and it was waiting. He resolved to return the next day with more than just curiosity. He'd bring someone with him, perhaps a local historian or an investigator, someone who could help him uncover the truth behind the strange occurrences. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that the shadows stretched just a little too far, reaching out from the house as if to pull him back. For Mrs. Thompson's sake, he would find answers. But deep down, Darius knew that he was facing a force he didn't fully understand, and that it was only a matter of time before the truth revealed itself, one way or another. Darius had never been a man easily swayed by superstition, but as he prepared to return to Mrs. Thompson's house that evening, he felt a chill run through him. The events of the past days weighed heavily on his mind, each strange detail layering itself over the last. He had called Ellen from the library earlier in the day, sharing what he'd found and asking if she could meet him at the house. If anyone understood the history of Copper Hill's thin places, as she had called them, it was her. She'd agreed, sensing the urgency in his voice. As he approached Mrs. Thompson's house, dusk was settling over the neighborhood, casting the old homes in eerie, elongated shadows. The street was empty, the silence almost oppressive. Darius found himself gripping the flashlight he'd brought, though the last traces of daylight still illuminated the path. He was grateful when he saw Ellen's small car parked along the curb. She stepped out, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern, holding a small notebook and a folder that looked stuffed with papers. "Thanks for coming," he said, giving her a nod. Ellen offered a small smile. "I wouldn't miss this for anything. You've got me curious, Darius, and, well, I want to make sure you're safe in there." Together, they walked up to the house, and as they reached the front door, Darius felt the weight of the day's earlier events settle over him. He unlocked the door, and they stepped inside, greeted by the now familiar stale air. The smell seemed stronger tonight, as if the house itself were reacting to their intrusion. Ellen wrinkled her nose, glancing around. "It smells like something old, something left alone too long." "Yeah, it's been like that every time I've come by," Darius replied. "But it feels different tonight. I don't know how to explain it." They moved into the living room, where Ellen immediately noticed the small wooden box he had discovered the night before. She opened it, her fingers tracing the carved edges, examining the photograph and the symbol. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Right here, on the coffee table," Darius replied. "It just appeared." Ellen's eyes darkened as she examined the strange spiral symbol. "This symbol, I've seen it before. It's a protective symbol, used in folklore and certain esoteric traditions. Some say it's meant to ward off spirits or negative energies." Darius felt a chill run through him. "Do you think Mrs. Thompson knew she needed protection from something?" Ellen nodded slowly. "It's possible. People in distress often seek out symbols or rituals to feel safe, even if they don't understand them. Maybe she was trying to protect herself from whatever presence she felt." They moved cautiously down the hallway, following the same path Darius had taken the night before. When they reached Mrs. Thompson's bedroom, he pointed out the notebook on the nightstand, flipping to the last entry where she'd written, "I am not alone. He is watching. He is waiting." Ellen's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "This is disturbing, Darius. It sounds like she truly believed she was haunted by something." "I think she did," he replied quietly. "The more I'm here, the more I feel like there's something watching me too." They fell silent, listening to the faint creaks of the old house, the slight rustle of air moving through unseen vents. Darius's heart pounded as he braced himself, hoping to confront whatever had plagued Mrs. Thompson. He glanced at Ellen, who seemed to sense his determination. She set her notebook down, folding her hands in front of her. "I brought these," she said, gesturing to a series of articles and notes in her folder. "They're old stories about this town, about places that, well, let's just say they're known for strange happenings. And Mrs. Thompson's house, it's in one of them." Darius stared at her, feeling a mixture of fear and anticipation. "What do you mean?" She pulled out a yellowed page with a headline that read, "The Curse of Copper Hill Manor." The article described an old mansion that had once stood on the site of Mrs. Thompson's home, a grand, Gothic structure that had burned down decades ago under mysterious circumstances. Rumor had it that the fire had been started by the owner himself, a man named Alistair Redford, who was rumored to be involved in dark, occult practices. Town gossip had claimed he'd experimented with contacting spirits and opening portals to other realms. "They say Alistair lost his mind after the fire," Ellen said, her voice soft, almost reverent. "The townspeople swore his spirit lingered, haunting the land and anyone who dared to build here." Darius felt a shiver crawl up his spine. "You're telling me this house is built on cursed land?" Ellen nodded, looking troubled. "I don't know if I believe in curses, Darius. But this story, it lines up with everything Mrs. Thompson wrote, and it might explain why she felt like something was always watching her." The pieces started to fall into place in Darius's mind. Mrs. Thompson's strange disappearance, her fear, the sense of a presence she couldn't escape. It all traced back to the land her home was built on, to the long-forgotten curse tied to Alistair Redford's doomed mansion. Darius steeled himself, feeling the surge of protectiveness. He couldn't let this darkness consume her. He had to find a way to sever whatever connection still bound her to this haunted ground. "Is there a way to stop this?" he asked, glancing at Ellen. "To end whatever's holding onto her?" Ellen hesitated, flipping through her notes. "There might be. Some old traditions suggest you can break a lingering spirit's hold by performing a cleansing ritual, something that acknowledges the spirit, but also asks it to leave in peace." Darius nodded, his jaw set. "Let's do it. Tonight." They gathered a few items from the house, a candle from Mrs. Thompson's drawer, a small bowl of salt from the kitchen, and the photograph from the wooden box. Ellen lit the candle and began the ritual, her voice low and steady as she recited words of release and protection. As she spoke, Darius closed his eyes, focusing on Mrs. Thompson's image in his mind, sending out a silent prayer for her freedom from this shadow that had plagued her life. The air grew heavy, a weight settling over them that felt almost suffocating. Suddenly, a chill swept through the room, and the candle flickered violently before going out. The temperature dropped, and they both shivered as an unseen presence seemed to press in around them. Ellen's voice grew louder, firmer, as she held up the salt and cast it in a circle around the candle. "Alistair Redford," she called out, her tone steady and unyielding. "If you are here, your time is over. You are no longer bound to this place. Release this woman, and let her live in peace." The room went silent, an unnatural stillness settling over them. Darius held his breath, feeling the tension coil tighter, as if the very walls were listening. Then, slowly, he felt the weight begin to lift, the pressure easing as the temperature in the room returned to normal. He opened his eyes, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow pass through the room, lingering near the window before fading into the night. The house seemed to exhale, a sense of calm settling over it that hadn't been there before. Ellen placed her hand on his shoulder, offering him a small, relieved smile. I think it worked." Darius felt a surge of relief, a sense of victory that brought tears to his eyes. He thanked Ellen, his heart full of gratitude, as they extinguished the candle and carefully placed everything back in its place. They left the house in silence, feeling a peace settle over them as they locked the door behind them. The next day, Darius visited Mrs. Thompson in the hospital. When he entered her room, he found her sitting up, a faint smile on her face, her eyes brighter than he'd seen them in days. "Darius," she said softly, her voice steadier than before. "I don't know what you did, but I feel different. I feel free." He sat by her bed, taking her hand in his. "I'm just glad you're okay, Mrs. Thompson. That's all that matters." As they spoke, he felt a warmth fill the room, a sense of lightness that hadn't been there before. Whatever darkness had haunted her had lifted, and he knew, deep down, that she would be safe from now on. That night, as he drove home, Darius looked back at her house one last time. It stood quietly under the stars, its windows dark and still. But there was no longer a sense of foreboding, no feeling of eyes watching him from the shadows. Mrs. Thompson's home was just a home again, a place of peace, freed from the grip of an old and restless spirit. And as he drove away, Darius knew he had done something good, something that went beyond his role as a mailman. He had protected someone who mattered, and he had given her back her life. The weight of Copper Hill's dark history was no longer his burden to bear, and he felt a quiet strength within him, knowing he had faced it and won.